Okay.
And I think I especially like your comment about so many traditions having light. And I especially like when you think of the menorah, that every day we see more and more light, and the hopefulness that that must bring to people experiencing that. So thank you so much for joining us and being part of our program. Look forward to meeting you in person. Thank you. So we are now going to get in back to our program here. You can see the name in case you're wondering. Here's the actual, oh boy, I have these problems. How do I advance my screen here? There we go. There's the spelling of Rabbi Camel's name. As I said, he's with Temple Israel in Minneapolis. And tonight we're talking about racial inequity and housing. And I just want to start with a little bit of review. We talked about, last session was all about homelessness and the various challenges. And when we look at homelessness with race, we really see some striking disparities. So we see that 79% of Minnesota's population is white. When we look at the population of those persons experiencing homelessness, that's 34%. When we look at African-American Minnesotans, we see 7% of the state's population, but 37% of the population of those experiencing homelessness. I get questions periodically about when we use the word African-American, or when we use the word Black, or when we use American Indian or Indigenous. And anytime we're using data, we're using the terms that were used in the source material. So if you're wondering why there's sometimes there differences, that's why. But I wanted to remind us at our session, when we talked, very first session, we had Laura Birnbaum from St. Louis County, who talked about the continuum of housing. And she shared a slide that was really striking, and I'm just going to bring it up again. So this is kind of a repeat for some of you, but this was specific to St. Louis County. And she looked, I want to look specifically at the data on the left. And so for many of you, this will be a reminder. But 8% of the people living in St. Louis County, so this is the part of the state that would include Duluth and the Iron Range, 8% are American Indian or people of color, other people of color. 18% of the people living in poverty in that county fall within our American Indians or people of color. And we see that interrelationship between race and poverty across the board in so many things. 39% of the people who are homeless and unsheltered, 44% on the coordinated entry list. So that's a system that you go through in order to be eligible to stay in a shelter. And 42% of the people in the county's homeless programs. So we go from 8% of the population in the county to 42% of the people that are in the programs. And this is shocking and awful. We see disparities in home ownership rates. So these are, just comparing how many people, when we look at who owns home, if I'm a white Minnesotan, 77% home ownership rate for Minnesotans of color, that drops to 41%. And at the bottom, I just wanted to do a comparison of the difference between Minnesota and nationally what we see. So the gap between people of color and white Minnesotans with homeownership is 36%. Nationally, that's 25%. So we are significantly above the national average. The Twin City Public Television did a wonderful story. It's called Jim Crow of the North. And it talks about systemic racism in Minnesota and how it's really impacted housing and how we came to be as segregated a community as we are here in the Twin Cities is focusing on. I'm going to ask people to turn off your video for some of our folks that may not have high-speed broadband. We've learned that if everybody, it's wonderful to see all your faces, but if we can see all of you, it slows down this somewhat. So I'm going to stop screen sharing now, and we're going to show you just a brief 2-minute clip that's kind of an introduction to the series. And then when we're done with that, we're going to talk a little bit, and then we're going to see a longer clip. But want to make sure that everybody can have some sense of what this is about. But it's really a wonderfully done segment on a terrible part of our history. So, Joan, when you have time, if you could bring that up and share it, that would be great.
Can you see that?
Yes, we're good.
Okay, great. Okay, just want to make sure.
We just need you to start it. Yeah.
This mob of over 100 people marched on an African American's house in October of 1909 to try to stop this family from moving in. The leading men of Minneapolis, as the newspaper called them, these are not the kind of people who want to be involved in mob violence. And they don't have to, because they have other tools that they can use. And there's this tool that they become aware of. It's called a racial covenant. And so just a few months after this confrontation, you see the first racial covenant appear in a Minneapolis property.
And this is where you first see this racial language.
Caucasians only, Aryans only, no Negroes or no members of African blood or descent.
100% of them were aimed at Black people.
In many ways, racial covenants, this is kind of ground zero of residential segregation. In the United States, and racism have a very, very long history, but this particular deployment of racism is fairly new, and this idea was really made material through instruments like racial covenants.
The law of the streets, the law of the courts working in consort to discourage Blacks from moving into white neighborhoods.
It starts out as private property developers, but eventually you have the federal government encouraging these racial covenants, demanding actually that any investment they make is protected with this kind of racial exclusivity.
When you can covenant entire areas of the city, it makes it off limits. That's pretty powerful.
So we are going to, excuse me, we are going to be watching a bit more of that in a moment. But I want to take a moment to just go over a few slides so you have a minute or two to kind of absorb some of the things that you're going to see fairly quickly when they show them on the clip. The first is, and we talk both about racial covenants and about redlining. This is an example of a racial covenant, and you'll hear a little bit about the Mapping Prejudice Project, which was started in Minneapolis, and now other groups are looking at it, and not just in the metro area. I know Mankato's looking at doing that, of really going through the actual title documents for property and seeing what's there. So I'm just going to give you a moment, and paragraph 5 is the one that we'd like you to notice. Now, some of these are worded this way. A number of others, as you saw in the introduction, list specific races that cannot live there. And then later, after the covenants had been in place for a while, you see not only looking at people of who are Negroes, as they use that term, or of African descent, or Moorish, or things. You see the addition of people who are Jewish included in concerns about property as well. And so when they talk about the federal government, you'll see that. And when we talk about Jim Crow and the term redlining and deciding which properties are deemed acceptable and which are deemed risky or non-desirable to be covered in terms of getting a mortgage, this is the kind of example you see here. And again, I'll give you a moment to see it, and you can see where this is expanding the kinds of people that they want to keep out, or kind of really segregating. So really determining that this is undesirable is the language. And then we'll see in a moment in the clip We end up with maps. This is part of the near north part of Minneapolis. And you can see just even individual blocks being determined to be undesirable. So I'm going to pass it back to Joan, and we're going to watch a longer clip. If any of you are having difficulty, hopefully with everybody's video off, this will go through. This is actually 14 minutes. So if you're having trouble.
Question is whose values and for whom's benefit? And I'd argue historically, low-income folks of color in particular, and larger racial and ethnic groups more broadly, have not been at the center of the benefits of urban planning.
The covenants were first put in 1910. But at that point, developers could start buying up large sections of farmland that had joined the city.
When a developer buys what used to be a farm on the outskirts of town, they buy it, divide it into 6 city lots, and sell the individual lots off. At that point, when they start selling off the individual lots, that's really when the racial covenants kind of injected into the property record.
So people like Samuel Thorpe Brothers, could buy this up and just plat it and lay it out as they saw fit and put in covenants. It was a very efficient way of doing this. There's this real estate convention. It's there that J.C. Nichols, who runs the Country Club Estates in Kansas City, gets up and said, a few years ago, I was really hesitant, but now I can't sell a property without them. And Sam Thorpe was certainly there. He was a retiring president. He comes back and in August of 1912, buys up the land that will become Thorpe Brothers Nokomis Terrace. And that is the first fully covenanted edition that I know of. It talks about no colored people or other objections with her. And Edmund Walton did the same thing along West River Road. At one point, I think they said he had bought up 437 acres along the river. He had gone in 1910 from sort of surreptitiously putting these covenants in, not recording them. Less than a decade later, he was bragging about them in the newspaper. There was an ad, and he printed the covenant, which shows you how quickly they were accepted.
The Supreme Court even held that restrictive covenants were constitutional. This was in the case of Corrigan v. Buckley, and it was in that decision where the court resolved that restrictive covenants are contracts, and as such, they are lawful. Now forget about the fact that they discriminate, and forget about the fact that once we say these contracts exist, we are bringing up a violation issue of the 14th Amendment. Forget about that. The key thing is that the Supreme Court validated segregation, validated discrimination.
You have the full force of the law, the court system, determining who could go where.
And what will happen as a result of that is you'll see efforts to ensure that a denial to one of the most basic foundations of opportunity for African Americans will be codified in the United States as a result.
You had not only the courts supporting it, but also a kind of license of sorts of people going to the streets and harassing blacks who moved into white neighborhoods. The white neighbors, knowing that the Francis couple was moving in, offered them money to not move into the house. William Francis and his wife Nellie, who is one of my heroes, rejected that and moved in, and as a result faced all kinds of harassment. The Francis family did not live there for very long because shortly after moving in, William T. Francis was appointed to be the consul to Liberia, in effect an ambassador, and so they moved to Africa. It's an example of how even the most prominent of African Americans in Minnesota at the time, who had established contacts with some of the most powerful people in American politics, Nellie herself had personal audiences with Andrew Carnegie and 3 U.S. presidents, that despite their successes and their influence, could still be exposed to racial animus. So it shows the intensity of property values, the perception of property values and race.
So what racial covenants did is they hardened boundaries. They hardened these invisible racial boundaries.
It's interesting because even in neighborhoods where there maybe aren't any covenants, just being in proximity to covenants is really powerful for keeping that neighborhood white still.
Homes are often taken for granted for some of us. Instances like the Lee family faced makes us realize that a home is a kind of fragile thing. It's a 1.5 story, quite modest bungalow. You wouldn't particularly notice it, but when you know anything about its history and the story of the Lee family, it becomes quite powerful.
Arthur Lee was a World War I vet. He worked for the post office.
He had a good, steady paycheck at a time when 30% of the city is out of work. So he finds this house that someone is willing to sell him on 46th and Columbus.
It was not covenanted.
They had the temerity to violate what is at that point this boundary in the urban landscape. So Arthur Lee, he moves into the house. First the neighborhood association gets together and they try to buy him out. They contact the bank, they contact different lawyers, they try legal means. In July of 1931, by newspaper reports, 5,000 or 6,000 white people at any given time are milling around his house, trying to drive him out.
Black paint was thrown on their house.
Their dog is poisoned.
Vandalism, intimidation.
The family has to sleep in the basement. They had the sense that they had set these boundaries, that no one was to violate them.
This is just another tool, so to speak, this citizen terrorism.
And in this particular case, Arthur, who was a World War I vet, right, comes home to believe that his service to our country gave him the same access as his white counterparts, but learned very quickly that that was not the case.
It was really important for families like the Lee family to have advocates to help them fight. Being able to have lawyers like Lena Olive Smith and being able to have the NAACP on their side was really powerful in making sure that their voices were heard. The NAACP was definitely fighting against these racial covenants and these instances of racial housing discrimination. There's also smaller clubs and organizations that were really focused on fighting this. Unfortunately, even with all of these legal protections and organizations fighting for them, a lot of people don't end up getting the end result that they want.
Edith and Arthur Lee and their daughter Mary, they stayed for 2 years. They didn't make it longer than 2 years. I think the pressure was just too great for them.
I can only imagine, as a parent, as someone who wants to ensure that I'm living my values, like what it would mean to put my family at risk, what it would mean to always feel like I'm looking over my shoulder, just to protect my right.
You have this escalation of this sense of threat thanks to racial covenants. So it's that intensification, that normalization of these racist ideas that leads to the Lee House.
The marker at the corner of the property has a depiction, an image of Arthur Lee. For those who just walk by, I think it gets them thinking about it.
Homeownership is the basis of a happy, contented family life. And now, through the use of a National Housing Act insured mortgage, is brought within the reach of all citizens on a monthly payment.
In the midst of the New Deal, when the FDR administration is looking for ways to try to stabilize the housing market, the Fair Housing Act is passed in 1934. And as part of that, the Homeowners Loan Corporation is also established with the hope that if you could establish long-term mortgages with fixed interest rates, you could create pathways to homeownership for most Americans.
This time they can buy this house with monthly payments that are less than they now spend for rent.
When the FHA starts underwriting mortgages in the 1930s, this really is a game changer in a lot of ways. It takes a lot of risk off the banks, it places it onto the federal government, and now working class, middle class families, they're able to purchase a home.
Unfortunately, as part of that, what the HOLC does is it establishes designations for neighborhoods based on the occupants of those neighborhoods.
And this is where the term redlining comes into place. The FHA, they made color-coded maps of all the largest cities in the United States, and they broke cities down into 4 different areas. Red is considered hazardous, that's the worst. Yellow is considered definitely declining. Blue is considered still desirable, and green is considered the best.
And what's so powerful about this kind of scale of measuring investment, it was about values and people.
The fact of the matter is that there was no evidence that those people who lived in those communities, predominantly black and brown people and foreign-born people, would have defaulted on loans.
There are no firm realities behind the close proximity to blackness and your property values going down. That's just not true.
The FHA is being very upfront and very explicit in how they're linking spatial desirability with racial occupancy. It's this racialization of space idea. So areas that were predominantly African American or majority minority, or really in a lot of cases, even if there's a few non-white people there, that's often enough to be redlined. So when they built these maps, they also explained why each area got the ranking it did.
The area around 4th Avenue South, which is called the Old South Side. This was a nice area. It had nice homes. It's the historic African American neighborhood on the south side of Minneapolis.
This one part of South Minneapolis was redlined specifically due to, and I'm quoting, a gradual infiltration of Negroes and Asiatics. The FHA refused to give an area a green-lined designation. Again, this is the best designation that they'll offer unless, and I'm quoting again, restrictive covenants are already in place. That line's from the FHA underwriting manual. Racial covenants aren't just about discriminating against people of color. It's about enriching white people. And I think that's the part that often gets lost in this narrative. And I think it does speak to the ways that white supremacy have been embedded in really built structures and built environments. I mean, if your grandparents bought a home on Minnehaha Creek, that home's worth, what, $500,000? If your grandparents rented an area that was redlined and then subsequently destroyed by a freeway project, you're not inheriting anything.
In a lot of ways, the practice of redlining, which didn't start until the 1930s, institutionalized and spread racial covenants all over the country because suddenly developers got sanctioned, they got direction from the federal government saying, this is best practices if you want to have a really high rating from us, if you want to get the most favorable terms for any loans.
By kind of de-integrating Minneapolis, which in many ways is what racial covenants are doing, this set the stage and enabled all these subsequent systems of inequality to really take hold.
John?
Yep.
It's very persistent myth that.
Thank you. So I would encourage all of you when we have our housing resources that'll come out in the email that you'll get tomorrow with your homework and a few other things. But I encourage you all to look at the entire video, the entire story, Jim Crow of the North. And there's also one that's done about the Rondo neighborhood, which if you live in St. Paul, 94 went right through a thriving Black community. And so there's one about that Rondo neighborhood. But I want to point out this map. So 1910, if you look at the map on the left, this is prior to the racial covenants coming in. You can see the lakes area down in southern Minneapolis, southern Minneapolis. You see on the right-hand side of both of those maps, the river. And you can see that there are people of color living right on the river road. There are people living along Minnehaha by several of the lakes there. And then when we go just 30 years later to 1940, you not only see a significant concentration of Minneapolis's Black population in North Minneapolis and in a few places, but you really see a complete moving away from any of them being present in South Minneapolis. And so if you look around the lakes, look around Minnehaha Parkway, he made the comment in the story about if I own a home and it's on Minnehaha Parkway, it's worth a lot of money. When I die, my kids either figure out a way to buy the home or they sell it, and that generational wealth keeps getting passed down. And so if you look at the areas of Minneapolis where homes would be highest in value, they are not the places where Minneapolis's Black population was allowed to live. And so we aren't just talking about where people can live, we're really talking long-term about the financial health of those families and just the opportunities that they have, schools, access to employment, a whole variety of things. But this was very striking to me. I also just want to point out this is not a race-based issue, but if you look at the map on the right, you'll see that it looks like there's a little bit more of Minneapolis in 1940 than there was in 1910. That was actually part of Richfield, which was not incorporated at the time, and kind of in the dead of night, well, maybe at an evening city council meeting, Minneapolis annexed part of Richfield. So periodically, if you're there, you'll see signs that still talk about Richfield things in that area. But I think this is probably the most striking example of really looking at the limitations on opportunity and the ability to choose where you want to live and to build wealth. This is a study from Harvard University, or data from a Harvard study that was looking just generally at the impact of homeownership on families' wealth. And it's very striking that it says for each year of successful homeownership, the household wealth increases by $9,500. Now, some of that is directly tied to the value of the home and that increasing. Some of that is tied to the opportunity that people have when they have a house. They have something to borrow against or to get a second mortgage if they need money to send someone to college or something else. It speaks directly to the opportunities that they have. Where you live impacts everything. And so if I'm a renter, I don't have that comparable increase in wealth. And so when we talk about home ownership and that disparities, this is a big piece of that. He talked about wiping out portions of South Minneapolis where there were predominantly Black homes. And that's the same thing that I referenced that happened in the Rondo area in St. Paul. But these aren't simply old facts. This isn't simply a case of there was systemic racism and we're working to address it, but is that the case now? So I just want to point out two things. First, this is from a KARE 11 investigation, and they looked at white and Black Minnesotans with similar qualifications, and you see that they found that Black borrowers were denied at 3 times the rate of applicants who were white with similar qualifications. And there was a national study, this was done by the Urban Institute, looking at Asian applicants. And so they looked not at anything that was subjective, they looked only at very objective, what is my, how much money do I have? Like, what is my net worth? And what is my credit score? And looked at if there was any difference in who would be granted mortgages, whites versus Asians. So this is from 2019. So these are current disparities that we see, and racism is really continuing there. I just included this. I talked a little bit about Rondo. As I said, it was a thriving neighborhood in St. Paul. When they were trying to figure out where to run the highway, they looked at the poor communities, they looked at the community of color and said, this is where we're going to run 94. Now, interestingly, part of 94 was also scheduled to go through the Powderhorn Park neighborhood in Minneapolis. And they got a big committee together. I mean, other neighborhoods did this as well, but the head of their committee was friends with the governor and was very well connected. And they said, we need to save Pratt School and the Witch's Tower, which is saved. If you drive along 94, you can see it off to your right or left, depending on what way you're driving. But they didn't have the power and the connections and the relationships with people making decisions in this neighborhood. And you not only had the decimation of that actual neighborhood itself, but those businesses weren't generally able to go and rent a storefront somewhere else and move their business to a different location. So this is one of several proposals to put together a Rondo land bridge across 94, kind of in the place where the old neighborhood was. And for those of you up in the Northland or who traveled up to Duluth or up the North Shore, think of the portion where the 35 goes under Leif Erikson Park, runs parallel to Lake Superior. This is a similar concept. And so the legislature approved, I think, $6 million to really study this and look at some proposals as part of the final negotiations in the last session. I'm hopefully going to turn it over to Metric Giles, and I'm on screen share, so I'm going to turn this over in the hopes that I can locate Metric. Metric, are you there?
And I haven't seen him.
Okay, we're going to go back to screen share, and then Joan, if you would keep your eye out for when he
I
shows
will.
up. So I'll do this now, and then we'll kind of come back to him if you keep your eye out for him. One of the things when we talk about race and housing that doesn't necessarily get immediate attention is environmental justice. And so I wanted to go over a couple things. There is a study done out of Tishman Environment and Design in the New School in New York, where they looked around the country in communities and said, where are trash incinerators located? And so the Minnesota data, this is actually a picture of the Minneapolis incinerator, which is in the near north portion of Minneapolis. But in 6 of 7 communities where they looked at incinerators, they were located in low-income communities and communities of color. And so this Minneapolis one, it's located near homeless shelters, low-income housing, communities of color. You'll see this for power plants. You'll see it for trash incinerators like here. You'll see it with toxic waste dumps. You'll see all kinds of things. So we see this. The Pollution Control Agency, this is kind of getting back to our first session. We talked a little bit about this, but did a study of toxic exposure. So how many Minnesotans in Minnesota live in a community where there's air pollution risks that are above the health guidelines? Now that doesn't necessarily mean that every day the air pollution is that way, but they live somewhere where there's a risk of that. And 91% of communities of neighborhoods in primarily made up of persons of color and indigenous people have that high level. But statewide, the average in Minnesota is 32%, which is pretty striking. So I want to talk about just something you don't necessarily think of, and this was just a tool we came across that I thought was just pretty remarkable. It's looking at tree equity, and you've heard a little bit about this. There's some money dedicated for tree equity in the bill that President Biden just has been stopping in Minnesota and elsewhere to talk about. But this is an index. It works statewide, so you can look at your community. And they look, these are the areas are divided by census block. So in case you're wondering what those are, that's kind of the area that they use for the census. And so you can look at various places and see what the tree score is. And that impacts a number of things. It certainly impacts just generally what I feel about the quality of life as I walk about around my neighborhood. It impacts the nature that I see, but it impacts temperature when we look at really hot days. So I'm going to advance. We're just going to go through a few slides here. And I just want to show the difference that a few blocks can make. So this is in St. Paul. You've heard a lot about Minneapolis. The reason St. Paul, you don't hear a lot about that isn't because necessarily St. Paul did things beautifully and they weren't discriminating. But in Minneapolis, all of the deeds are digitally recorded, and in St. Paul, they're not. So when the Mapping Prejudice Project began working on seeing what they could find out in terms of the deeds, that's why they looked at Minneapolis. And so I'm going to talk about St. Paul here for a minute. So there's a block of land here. If you're familiar with St. Paul, this is the Midway area. It's where the Minnesota United play. It's where the Loon Stadium is. There's a Target store. There's, kind of a couple of strip malls there. So this block with the 34 tree index is developed. It's there's parking lots. It's got a low score. Okay, maybe there's a little bit of green, but not very much. But if you go just to the left of that block, so I'm in that square, you can see I go to 61 for my tree index. I'm going to go just below that block, which geographically is Crossing University. Okay, so on one side of University, that's a score. On the other side of University, significantly higher, 80. And I'm going to go one block to the left of this, and you'll see a score of 95. Okay, I'm going to go back to those again, and I'm going to have you look at something different than just the blocks. At the lower left of your screen, you'll see something called score indicators, and there's kind of a red blob of sorts, and it's looking in this area at a number of indicators, rates of employment, persons of color, how many people live in poverty. And one of those is temperature, but you'll see all these other indicators. So when we look at this spot where we have AutoZone and the Goodwill store and a number of other things there, you can kind of see, we see a lot of red. The temperatures on a hot day, it's pretty high. We see a lot of people in poverty. We see pretty high unemployment rate, actually very high unemployment rate. Okay, now I'm going to move, we're going west toward Minneapolis here. 61, you see the temperature is still pretty high because the index isn't there, but some of those indicators are getting better. I don't know that I'd say 10% unemployment is great, but we'll see that. And then as we continue, we'll see that red shrinking. So we crossed University, we see it shrinking, and we go one block more, and we really see that difference. And so when we look, one of the things that we're asking you to do for your homework is to, just as you drive around your neighborhood, look at the places where there's a lot of industrial development. Look at the places if you have an incinerator or a major power plant or brownfield. Think of where those are and look at the people that are living around those areas. So has Metric shown up, Joan?
No, he has not. Unless he has the phone number that starts with 763.
No, Metric, if you're there, would you speak up, please?
But
okay, we're gonna move on to our discussion groups. I will tell you a little bit about Metric and why we included him. He's the executive director of the Community Stabilization Project, which is in St. Paul. It's a group that does community organizing to really help people address the reality of the challenges that they see. But his offices, the people there are dealing every day with the results of the systemic racism that we've just seen. The redlining, the racial covenants, the decimation of a thriving community. And they see, as I said earlier, if I'm a person of color, it's harder for me to get a mortgage. It may be harder for me to get someone to rent to me. I'm going to continue to have challenges. So we're going to go to our breakouts. And if we'll kind of speed things up a little bit, I would suspect something came up that you didn't plan. So I'm going to go ahead. These are the three things we'd like you to think about with your groups. First, and we're going to alter it a little bit, but when you think about the Jim Crow of the North film clip, or some of the things that we've seen on the slides, when you look at that data, what really gives you pause? What surprised you? What really makes you stop and really be taken aback at the disparity and the inequity that you see here? Second, when you get into breakout groups, one of the things I've really loved when I've sat in on them is, how diverse they are, and we have people from across the state that are watching. So what realities of structural racism do you see or have you experienced in your neighborhood or your city? And then finally, I'm always surprised by some people who aren't as familiar with some of these issues. I think maybe they're more present to those of us in the metro area than they are to people that are living in greater Minnesota. But if you just start by introducing yourselves and looking at these questions, it's 7:16 right now, so I'm going to bring us back together at 7:45. So I'm going to stop sharing this so that I can get the breakout groups. And Joan, I'm just going to ask if while I'm doing that, you can make a few comments about what they should expect tomorrow in their email.
Yes, so one, thank you all for being here. And tomorrow you'll see an updated reading list that we've provided each month. And there is a section in there under racial inequities in housing. And then you'll have a homework assignment as well, if you choose to do that. And then that homework assignment, if you haven't seen the full video of Jim Crow of the North, we recommend that you do view that. And you could also as well look at Mapping Prejudice website. But one of the homework pieces in particular we'd like you to do is to look at your neighborhood or your city and look at environmental hazards that you may be aware of in your neighborhood or your city. So that could be a power plant, an incinerator, as Ann mentioned earlier. It could be water pollution or a brownfield. I think it was the Phillips neighborhood that was concerned about a brownfield and was recommending to the city council an alternative use for some property. So if you would look around your neighborhood and think about who lives next to those areas or in those areas, and what are the consequences to housing in those areas. And then we also want you to explore the Tree Equity website that Ann went over and look at that for your neighborhood. See what your score is for shade and for trees and see how that's related to income, poverty levels, and the temperature is really very interesting too. And then finally, you could also look at the video that is more about Interstate 94 and the history and its impact on, especially the impact it didn't have as severely in the Prospect Park area, and then the impact in the Rondo neighborhood. But we will send that out via email, and then early next week, we will have the video ready and we'll have that on the website as well. One important thing is to send this out to all of you. We need your email. So if you haven't registered previously in October, if you can share your email in the chat or or send it to me and I will put my email in the chat. That would really help us. And then Ann will give a plug for signing up for emails at the end of the evening too.
Okay, so we're going to break into your groups and you'll get a 1-minute warning when we're coming back in. So here we go. You have to actually accept to go into the group. You should get a notice. You'll be invited and we hope you join.